So welcome to this AI ethics seminar, and especially welcome to today's speaker, Sven Nyholm from the Utrecht University. And he will speak about AI and moral responsibility, mind the gap, with a tantalizing question mark at the end. Sven, please go ahead.
Thank you, Olle. Let's see, I'm going to see if I can start my slides and get on my way here. Okay, I think that hopefully you should be seeing the slides now. So mind the gap or mind the gaps question mark. And so I'm going to be talking about more different kinds of possible gaps in responsibility. And the question is also whether we should mind them or not. Are they bad, so to speak, or should we perhaps even welcome some of the gaps? I am among those who worry about possible responsibility gaps, but as we will see, I have colleagues who don't worry, either because they think that we can easily fill them, or because perhaps we should even welcome them. But more on that in a second. But I'm going to start by going back to 2016. And so I think a lot of people in this audience would recognize this man. So this is in March of 2016, and Lee Sedol, in one of the, I think there were 5 games that he played against AlphaGo. He won one of them, but the other 4 were won, if you can say that, by AlphaGo. Or it's at least clear that he lost those 4 games. Now, so one thing that I found interesting about those games were that, of course, AlphaGo was a computer program, it was not a robot. And so there had to be a human, the gentleman there on the left, who had to move around the playing stones on the board. And in a certain sense, he's a little bit like the person in Searle's Chinese room experiment, because, you know, well, for people who don't know about that, so this is a thought experiment where you're given instructions for how to create messages in Chinese. Even if you don't know Chinese, you can maybe follow the instructions, and so you can produce something meaningful. And it could very well be that this person on the left gets instructions for what to do, and so he is in effect carrying out the action of beating Lee Sedol in Go, but presumably he would never be able to do so without the computer program. He may not understand the strategies that the program developed, because it played, well, at first, I think, observed thousands of games played by humans, and then it also played millions of games against itself, developing strategies that no human could have figured out, because no human had beaten Lee Sedol before this. And so one interesting question is who exactly, as I said before, I mean, it's clear who lost the game, so Lee Sedol, and he even quit playing. Well, that's what he said, at least after the game. He said he was going to quit playing Go because he felt that it was now meaningless. But who won the game exactly? Who can get credit for it? Who deserves credit? Is it certainly probably not the man on the left there, because he was just following orders, so to speak. Now, what about the people who created the program? Well, again, they didn't play all of those thousands of Go games that the program had been trained on. They didn't play those millions of games against itself that the AlphaGo did in order to develop these strategies. So there might here be a case where we have a loser, the human being, but no clear winner, and so no one who is, so to speak, positively responsible in a clear way for this defeat of Lee Sedol. Now, let's go 2 years into the future, namely to March of 2018. And there we again have interaction between humans and AI systems, where there's a clear loser. So this is when Elaine Herzberg was hit and killed by an experimental self-driving car. Now, the question is whether this person here on the left, who was the safety driver, is a little bit like that man that was moving the stones around, not perhaps knowing exactly what was going on, and certainly didn't react in time to stop the car. So, I mean, the AI system, according to some reports, it was not able to properly classify Elaine Herzberg as a target that one was not supposed to hit. It kept jumping back and forth between bicycle, sign, vehicle, and never taking any appropriate action. The human being did not react in time, and there was a tragic outcome, the death of one person. Now, there too, you might think that it's unclear who, I mean, it's clear who the loser was, I mean, the person who was hit and killed, but who exactly is responsible? I think the first thing that happened after this event was that Uber, who was running this experiment, offered a financial settlement to the family of the deceased person. But then there was discussion of who exactly was to blame, and that is, I think, considered as being unclear. Now, so I'm talking about possible gaps in responsibility here. And when one talks about that, the case that pretty much always comes up in relation to AI are military applications. And so there's something that people might have heard of called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. And one of the main arguments for why they think that one should, as they put it, stop killer robots is that they think that unclarity about responsibility and accountability will arise. And so that's the case, perhaps along with the self-driving car, that people most often discuss. And those are what you might call negative cases of having to do with blame and punishment. But I think, as I will argue, that we should also concern ourselves with what you might call positive cases. Again, maybe the winning a game, such as playing Go, that can be seen as a kind of positive outcome. And so we might want to know, who is to praiseworthy, who should get recognition and be responsible in the positive sense as well. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be kind of identifying 4 very broad categories of responsibility and 4 corresponding broad categories of possible gaps in responsibility related to the use of AI systems. And then, as I said, ask the question, should we mind these gaps? Should we try to fill them? Should we worry about them, or what? So those are the topics for today. Okay, so let me first just say something very, very broad about responsibility, or actually I'm going to say a couple of things. And the first thing maybe to notice is that obviously responsibility is discussed in legal contexts, and so there's civil law and criminal law, and there are different ideas about what makes someone responsible in those contexts. But we can also discuss more broadly ethical questions. And so it might be, of course, that there isn't yet any clear understanding of the legal situation, but you might still sort of philosophize, so to speak, about moral responsibility. And in certain legal systems, you may think that what people are being held legally responsible for doesn't fit with or track what they should be morally responsible for. So we can, in an ideal situation, so to speak, maybe the two would be very closely related, but there's no guarantee, especially not when we are dealing with new technologies that maybe are developing more quickly than the legal system, so to speak. So my main focus today is on moral questions, ethical questions about responsibility, but I hope that some of the things I'm going to be saying also has some application for legal questions. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to just note about responsibility. So we're primarily talking here about ethical questions, but the value and the ethics of responsibility. Now, when it comes to responsibility, David Shoemaker and others, Gary Watson has also written about this. They say that there are different, what they call phases of responsibility, different aspects, if you will. You have, the question of, okay, so who is causally responsible, like who's behind an outcome? That's one kind of question you can ask. To whom can we attribute the production of the outcome that has been achieved? Maybe it's a particular facet of my character that can be seen as responsible, so to speak, for my having acted in a certain way that led to a certain outcome. Those are all questions having to do with attributability, if that's the word. Then you can also ask, who is able to answer questions about what has happened? So these are questions about answerability. And so it could be that you could attribute some outcome to my having acted in a certain way on the basis of a psychological feature that I have, but it might be, if it's temporary insanity, let's say, then maybe I can't really answer questions about this because I didn't know what I was doing. So there may be no answerability in this particular case. I also already mentioned the expression, I think, before, accountability. That's another phase of responsibility, who can later be held to account. And Again, these things may sometimes all go together. So maybe you can attribute a certain action or outcome to my behavior and character, and then maybe I'm able to answer questions and be held accountable. But it could be that I have one phase of responsibility present, so to speak, without the others. Again, perhaps because I'm temporarily insane, or because I'm not yet an adult. I'm a young person who is growing into a responsible person, and I'm not quite there yet. So there might be different reasons why different aspects of responsibility come apart. And that's going to be important when we talk about some reactions to the idea of responsibility gaps. Okay, so well, speaking of responsibility gaps, let's get to that idea now. So I am talking today about this topic in relation to AI and AI technologies, but there's another context in which this is often also discussed, namely in relation to group behavior. And so if we all form an organization together, the people that are here today, and we act in some way, and again, there might be a good outcome or a bad outcome, then the question is who exactly is responsible. Now, some people are skeptical about the idea that groups can be responsible agents, but at the same time, they may feel that, well, this was a group acting, and so we can't really point the finger to any particular person, and so there might be a responsibility gap related to the group behavior. That's one big discussion, and some people say that we can fill those gaps by actually regarding groups as a kind of responsible agent, but more on that later. Now, the other main context where responsibility gaps arise is the one that we are focusing on today, namely AI and robotics contexts. And in a certain sense, when you think about some of the ways in which people basically define the idea of AI, you can already see where there might be gaps in responsibility, because people sometimes say that we have AI when we're able to outsource tasks that were previously performed by humans who had to use their intelligence to machines. And so in a certain sense, if those are tasks for which the human being in question was responsible, and we give that responsibility of performing this task to a machine, and the machine or AI system is not a responsible agent, then we have actually taken some task that a person was responsible before, we've handed that over to a system that maybe is not responsible, and thereby create a possible gap, or at least confusion in terms of who should be held responsible for any good or bad outcomes. Okay, so speaking of good and bad outcomes, now when people talk about these possible gaps in responsibility, they tend to speak about what I'm going to call negative responsibility. So questions about, okay, so if something bad happens, who should be blamed, who should be punished? But as I was hinting at before, I mean, we can also ask more positive questions. And so let's say that a certain good outcome is achieved, a person's, I don't know, illness is properly diagnosed, and a good treatment is selected, and the person's life is saved. Now, that's a very positive outcome, and we might ask questions, okay, who can we praise for this nice outcome, who is positively responsible, who can we recognize for the good work that they did? Well, again, here you might, well, what if the illness was diagnosed by an AI system who also possibly recommended a treatment procedure, and then someone just had to carry out the treatment? Then maybe there might be unclarity about who was praiseworthy for this positive outcome. So we have questions about the good, who's praiseworthy, who should be rewarded, who should be recognized. Maybe we also have questions about the bad when it comes to responsibility, who should be punished, who should be blamed, etc. That's one distinction. And in order to identify 4 types of responsibility gaps, I'm going to introduce another distinction. So when people talk about responsibility, they sometimes talk about, they often talk about responsibility in a sort of backward-looking sense. So after something has happened, so someone has been hit or killed by a car, let's say, you can ask who, if anyone, is responsible and should be punished for this, held to account. Or after something good has happened, so again, a life is saved, let's say, then who should we praise for this? Who should we applaud for this nice outcome? Those are questions looking backwards and holding people responsible to now for what happened in the past. But you can also, of course, look into the future, and you can ask Well, there's a risk that a certain bad outcome might come about. And do we have anyone whose responsibility it is now to try to make sure that that future outcome is avoided? Or there might be a good outcome. And so you might ask, whose responsibility is it now to make sure that we try to bring about this good outcome? So if we are parents, for example, and we have children, we typically think that we have a responsibility to do what's best for our children, to raise them well, to take good care of them, so that in the future things go well for our children. So that's a future directed or forward-looking responsibility of a positive kind. And so if you take these two distinctions, you basically get four kinds of responsibility that you might have. You might have a backward-looking negative responsibility, so something bad has happened and you are to blame, so to speak. Or you might have done something good in the past, and so there's a backward-looking positive responsibility. We applaud or reward you or recognize your what the good things that you did in the past. Or, as I said, maybe you're a parent and you have a forward-looking positive responsibility to try to make sure that things go well for your children. And so quite often when we think about this forward-looking positive responsibility, it has to do with special relationships. And so a doctor might have a special relationship with their patient, so that there are special duties to try to make sure that good outcomes are achieved in the future. Maybe a lot of us are teachers. We have special responsibilities to sort of help our students to do well. If we're parents, we may have a forward-looking positive responsibility to try to make the future good for our children. And so very often when they're not these special relationships, people are much less willing to accept that they are positively responsible for things that may happen in the future. Okay, so we also have forward-looking negative responsibilities. Again, as I said, there might be a possible negative outcome. So like if you're out driving and you see that something bad is about to happen, unless you kind of turn the other way, then you may have a forward-looking responsibility to turn the wheel and to steer away from the possible accident that you're seeing that might happen if you continue going straight. Okay, so we have four broad kinds of responsibilities. That should also mean that we have four possible kinds of gaps in responsibility that could arise. And so basically you just have to add the word gap here in the diagram, and you get these following kinds of potential responsibility gaps. And so you could have gaps in responsibility having to do with backward-looking negative responsibility. Something bad has happened and it's unclear who, if anyone, can be punished or blamed, held responsible in a negative sense. Something good has happened and it might be unclear who, if anyone, should be praised or rewarded, applauded, recognized for the good outcome. There might be something good that could happen in the future, but it's unclear who, if anyone, has a positive responsibility to try to promote that good outcome. So there might be a gap in the responsibility of a forward-looking positive sort. There might be a possible negative future outcome. And so there might happen and that in the future, some people, such as our host today, Olle, he worries about AI getting out of control and causing harm in the future. There might be a question of, okay, whose responsibility is it to make sure that that doesn't happen? Well, someone like Olle is trying to take it upon himself to solve the problem, but is it really his responsibility? Is it maybe the responsibility of the big tech companies, or whose responsibility is it to avoid these bad future outcomes? If there are unclarities, then there might be what I'm calling forward-looking negative responsibility gaps. So in theory, we should be able to identify these kinds of possible gaps in responsibility, just using the simple distinctions between negative and positive responsibility and between backward and forward-looking responsibility. So what about the sort of academic literature? Have these gaps been discussed? Well, certainly backward-looking negative responsibility gaps have been discussed a lot. And so, for example, when Robert Sparrow, in a very well-known article about what he calls killer robots, actually the article itself is called Killer Robots, he argues that we shouldn't allow, very much like what I said before about the campaign to stop killer robots, we shouldn't allow autonomous weapon systems driven by AI for the reason that responsibility gaps may arise after something bad has happened. So that is a worry about possible backward-looking negative responsibility gaps. If people worry that it's unclear who should be held responsible when a self-driving car hits or kills someone, that might also be a case that has been discussed a lot by myself and others. Now, when it comes to backward-looking positive responsibility gaps, so John Danaher and I, we wrote an article about what we call achievement gaps. And so we were focusing on workplaces in particular, but the idea is that, you know, if again, tasks that human beings were previously outsourced, responsible for are outsourced to AI systems, then maybe there's less room for human achievement in the workplace or elsewhere. And so there's less room for us to be positively responsible for good things that happen. Again, maybe the AI system is diagnosing problems patients are having, they're recommending treatments, they are doing legal work, etc., etc. So there's less room for medical staff or lawyers and other human experts, so to speak, to actually do much and get credit for anything. And so there might be a possible achievement gap, we argued. When it comes to forward-looking negative responsibilities, I myself have elsewhere discussed what I call obligation gaps. And so if it's not you driving and trying to avoid an accident, but it's a self-driving car, maybe you are riding in the self-driving car, but you have fallen asleep. It's a self-driving car after all. And so the self-driving car detects that a crash might happen. And so it has to sort of take action. But the question is then, who exactly has an obligation to do this? Is it the self-driving car? Well, I mean, it's not a moral agent, you might say, doesn't have obligations of the sort of we do. And perhaps it's unclear who, if anyone, has any forward-looking obligations. Now, some colleagues of mine, Filippo Santoni De Sio and Julio Mecacci, they talk about what they call active responsibility. I think this is pretty much the same idea, that we are supposed to actively, you know, watch out for risks and bad outcomes. And if that is taken over by AI systems, and again, it might be unclear whose responsibility it is to kind of be on the alert for bad things that might happen, at least in the moral sense of responsibility. I mean, the system might be given the cost of responsibility, so to speak, the task of doing it, but is it ethically obligated to do so? Now, the fourth category here of positive forward-looking responsibility gaps, that is not something that at least I have found a lot of literature about. Rather, I found very little literature about it. I myself have written a little bit about it, and I have suggested that perhaps what is called AI alignment might be a case where there's a positive forward-looking responsibility gap. So the idea is that we should try to align AI with human values so that good outcomes are achieved. And it would be really great if, you know, AI could bring about all sorts of good outcomes in the future. But like I said before, typically it's mainly when we have special relationships with people that we are willing to take on responsibilities to bring about good outcomes. If I'm a parent, I'm willing to, you know, put in a lot of work to raise my children well and produce good outcomes. But if I have to help strangers, then very often most people say, well, you know, I don't feel that I'm responsible for doing so. If I do it, it's very nice of me, but it's not a positive responsibility. And so if something like AI could in the future produce lots of really good outcomes, then there might be people who are willing to try to work towards that goal because they might expect that there will be some reward for them, but they may not be willing to see themselves as having a responsibility to do so. Because they might say, okay, I have a responsibility for my children, for my patients, for my students, but I don't have a responsibility to try to produce good outcomes for total strangers. So that may be one case where we could have forward-looking positive responsibility gaps. Okay, so I've talked about 4 broad kinds of gaps that there might be. Some may be more worrying than others. Some are definitely discussed in the literature much more than others. Let's now, however, look at how we might fill these gaps or whether we should at all try to fill them. So one possible solution might be that people actually kind of volunteer themselves and step forward and fill a gap. I mean, so think about this quote from, you know, I can't remember what American president it was, but some American president said, yeah, the buck stops with me, I'm responsible. And it's a kind of power move in a certain sense, but by stepping forward and saying, like, I take responsibility, you place yourself in an important position. And so then that might involve certain costs, but it may also be a way of asserting yourself and your status. And so perhaps when it comes to these responsibility gaps, we could hope that people would be just volunteer themselves. I mean, some companies have said, for example, Volvo and Audi have on occasion said that when they develop fully self-driving cars, they will take at least some of the responsibility for any problems that these cars cause. Other companies, such as Tesla, when there have been accidents, have said it's not our responsibility because there was a deal between us and the customer that they would take responsibility for anything that bad that might happen. So maybe this is a solution that we could imagine. A problem, however, is that depending on what kind of responsibility gap we're looking at, people may be more or less willing or eager to take responsibility. And I think we can observe certain asymmetries in people's motivation to take responsibility for things. So here's one asymmetry. So if something good has happened, then quite often people are very willing to take responsibility and say, well, yeah, it was me, I did it. But if something bad has happened and there's talk about, who should we punish, who should we blame for this, then all of a sudden people are very unwilling. They say, well, it wasn't me. They're willing to point their finger at others and say, well, maybe it was them, but I didn't do it. So hoping to fill responsibility gaps by having people take responsibility when it comes to backward-looking responsibility is going to work much better when it comes to positive responsibility than when it comes to negative responsibility, because in general, it's costly to take responsibility for bad outcomes because you might be liable to punishment, to having to pay fines, having to apologize, or your social status might go down, etc. Whereas having a responsibility for positive outcomes can be beneficial for you. And so there are clear incentives to take responsibility for positive things. Now, however, when it comes to future positive things, then people are much less willing to take responsibility, as was mentioned before. So if something good has already happened, it's in the past, we don't have to do anything, we're quite happy to take responsibility. But if we're looking into the future and the question is, okay, who's going to take on the responsibility of bringing this good thing about? Again, suddenly people start becoming much more lukewarm about the idea of taking responsibility, because here too, there might be a cost involved. There might be an opportunity cost. If I take on the responsibility of producing a certain good outcome, then I cannot do other things that may be more beneficial to me in the short run. And so my responsibility and my willingness to take responsibility for future things that haven't yet happened may be much weaker than my willingness to take responsibility for good things that have already happened. I don't have to do anything. So there might be a worry here about filling responsibility gaps because of different asymmetries in people's motivation. Plus, when people step forward and say that, yeah, I'm happy to take responsibility for something good that's happened, then others around them may feel, well, did you actually do anything? Did you take, were there any efforts involved in your part? So other people might not be willing to allow them to take credit. So this whole idea of filling responsibility gaps by just having people take responsibility, that seems to be somewhat problematic. Well, I mean, maybe we shouldn't be so worried about responsibility gaps. Maybe we should welcome them. I mean, this can be read in different ways. So there's one article by Thomas Simpson and Vincent Müller, and in which they argue that, well, maybe we shouldn't exactly welcome responsibility gaps created by AI, but maybe we can tolerate them. And so, for example, if military robots or self-driving cars would make the world safer on the whole, so that there would be fewer civilians killed, or there would be fewer pedestrians killed by cars, then there might be unclarity with regard to responsibility, but at least on the whole, more lives are saved. And so we can tolerate responsibility gaps should they arise. That's one view. But John Danaher, who I already mentioned before, he has a much stronger view. He says, no, we shouldn't just tolerate responsibility gaps. We should sometimes positively welcome them. Because actually human life is filled with a lot of tragic choices and for which we are held responsible. And so wouldn't it be nice to be able to outsource some of these choices to AI systems that are not responsible, but we are also not responsible, so we can avoid the burdens of having to make tragic choices. That's one argument he gives. Another argument he gives is that actually, maybe we don't have the kind of free will that is required to be more responsible. Ultimately, everything we do is somehow caused by the laws of nature, and so from that point of view, maybe we shouldn't be held responsible, and so it's good if AI makes us less responsible, so to speak, because they take over our tasks. So that's a kind of quite philosophical argument. I'm not going to discuss that second argument in detail, since there are lots of controversies in the theory of free will about whether we can, understand determinism and free will as compatible, that's the compatibilist point of view, and or whether we should say, as P.F. Strawson does, for example, that actually responsibility is a kind of social practice, and it doesn't really require that we think about things such as the metaphysics of determinism. That's a philosophical discussion for the seminar room, but in everyday life, questions about responsibility have to do with social practices. How do we live together? How do we distribute tasks amongst ourselves, etc. So we should take a much more down-to-earth kind of approach to that topic than Danaher suggests Strawson would say. Now, the response that I would give as an additional thing to think about here is that, let's say that John is right, that we should outsource responsibilities to AI systems. Well, then, maybe that's, as he says, it's nice not to have to be blamed for things, but we also have the question about positive responsibility. I want to be credited and praised for good things that I think I'm doing, but if I'm handing over those tasks to machines or AI systems and I'm no longer have any opportunities to shine, so to speak, then I'm not so sure I welcome responsibility gaps anymore. So you may be throwing out the negative responsibility, with the bathwater, but then the positive baby of being able to be praised or rewarded might be thrown out at the same time. And so Danaher's arguments, they seem to be more convincing when we focus on negative responsibility than when we focus on positive responsibility. And most people writing about responsibility gaps, they feel that responsibility gaps are actually intolerable. And so, for example, Christian List, who I'm about to get to, he argues that unless we can find people to hold responsible, or the AI system can somehow respond for itself, then we shouldn't introduce these technologies that bring about gaps in responsibility, because as he sees things, responsibility gaps are intolerable. Okay, but as I also said at the same time, actually Christian List and some others, they are open to the idea that, well, actually maybe we outsource what is a human responsibility to an AI system. Well, maybe the AI system can be responsible, not just perform the task, but also be responsible for that task. So this is not Christian List, but this is Daniel Tygert, and he argues, referring to this idea of different phases of responsibility, saying that, okay, well, maybe the AI system can't be accountable for what it's doing, but it can be answerable because it can provide answers for why it did what it did. We can maybe attribute responsibility to the AI system in the sense that we can explain why something happened by explaining that it was a process involved in this AI system. So there might be certain phases or aspects of responsibility that can be outsourced to AI systems, according to Daniel Tygert. Here's Christian List, who I mentioned before. He takes actually a stronger view. He says that even though current AI systems may not have the capacities that we associate with responsible moral agents, there's no kind of conceptual reason why, if we had an AI system that could make informed decisions, that could take in information about ethical standards, that could process them somehow, that could realize what kind of objections people might raise to a different course of action, and that could put its foot down, so to speak, and take a decision, then there's no in principle reason, he argues, why they couldn't be responsible AI systems. And he makes a comparison to what I mentioned early on in the presentations. I said that there are some people who say that groups of people can band together, form an organization, and have a kind of group level responsibility, corporate responsibility, as it's sometimes called. Well, List argues that, well, that is actually a kind of artificial intelligence, because we have with systems that are not individual human beings that are behaving intelligently and that can be responsible. In this case, the system is composed of humans, but if such forms of artificial intelligence can be responsible, then why couldn't technologically based artificial intelligence systems be responsible? Now, that's the suggestion that LIST makes, and as I said, Tigard makes similar suggestions. I worry a little bit that it's not always clear why we would want to hold AI systems responsible, because as I mentioned before, I mean, so P.F. Strawson and others, they argue that responsibility is a kind of practice where we hold each other responsible, and we like the idea of being praised, and then maybe we sometimes also like praising other people for good things they do, and we feel that that's satisfying, so to speak. We well, in some potentially strange way, it can be satisfying to blame someone too, because we feel that they deserve it, so to speak. Robert Sparrow says that blaming yourself, feeling guilty, involves suffering in a certain sense. You suffer a bad conscience. If a machine cannot suffer a bad conscience or cannot suffer from any punishment or blame from outside, then what's the point of punishing the robot or the machine? So the question does arise when we talk about holding AI system responsible. Okay, what exactly is the point of doing so? Does it serve the same function as praising, or holding a person responsible in a positive sense, or blaming them, or holding them responsible in a negative sense? That's unclear. Okay, so let me mention one last possible solution that I myself am attracted to, and I've argued for in my 2020 book that's called Humans and Robots. I suggest that in a certain sense, with some similarity to what List is talking about, he's talking about group agency. I suggest, and some others also, that we should think of indeed group agency, but where the group consists actually of humans and AI systems or machines together. And so if my organization is using AI to achieve some of its goals, then actually you could see my organization and the AI as forming a kind of system. And then you can ask whether in acting together with this AI system, not me personally, but the organization as such can somehow be responsible. And in the human case, we have different kinds of organizations. Some are totally egalitarian, and then maybe the whole group is responsible in a collective sort of way. But we also have hierarchical organizations where people at the top are more responsible at the top of the hierarchy than the people at the bottom, so to speak. And so something like a military organization, the higher up the chain of command, you have more rights to command people to do things, but you also have more responsibilities. And so even if you command a soldier to do something and they go off and do the hard work, you may have a certain responsibility for what they're doing on your order, so to speak. And so that kind of model of a hierarchical organization could, I think, be useful when you think about responsibility gaps in AI. We could see ourselves as acting, working together with these systems in the kind of the role of a commander, if you will. And so we might have a kind of command responsibility for what we do together with these systems. The systems might be doing a lot of the work, but we might shoulder responsibility, so to speak. Now, as I said, I've argued for that in some other work and it's different places, but I do actually worry about this idea as well, especially when it comes to what I'm calling positive responsibility, because when it comes to negative responsibility, in general, it's easier to be on the hook, so to speak. And so when we do something and there's a bad side effect of what we do, we knowingly are pursuing one goal, but we also realize that there are certain possible side effects, then we are typically held responsible, not only for pursuing our main goal, but also for any side effects that we knowingly are allowing to happen. And that is typically enough for us to be held responsible. Or if I have a certain end goal in mind and I'm doing something else as a means to achieving my goal, then very often I'm responsible both for pursuing my goal and for any means I take to achieve the end goal, especially if those means are negative for other people. It's not exactly, and you can take that idea and you can say, well, if I'm using an AI system to achieve a certain goal and there's certain side effects, people being injured or killed or whatever by the AI system, then perhaps I have to take responsibility for those side effects of my goal pursuit. But when we are thinking about the positive case, and we're thinking about, so set AI aside for the moment. And so let's say that I'm pursuing my own self-interest in a narrow self-interest, and as a side effect, I create a good outcome. So I do something that's good for Olle, let's say. In a certain sense, he might be pleased that the good outcome occurred for him. But if I was just trying to achieve my own self-interest and it was just a side effect that things went well for him, then we don't start applauding me, like, say like, well done. It's rather that, well, that's nice that had happened, but you don't really deserve any credit for it because it was just a side effect of something that you were doing for your own good. I mean, there's a case that Joshua Knobe discusses in his work about people's intuitions about intentionality, where in the first variation of that case, there's a CEO who is adopting a policy, and he's informed by one of his advisors that, if you do this, it's going to harm the environment, but it's also going to make a lot of money. The CEO says, I just care about making money. Let's implement the policy. Sure enough, the environment is harmed, and they also make a lot of money. Here, most people say the CEO intentionally harmed the environment and should be blamed for it. Now, if you change that story and you just change the word harmed to helped, and you say, the CEO learns about this new policy that they could adopt, it's going to help the environment and make a lot of money. And the CEO says, I don't care about helping the environment. I only care about making money. They implement the policy, and wow, the environment is helped and they make a lot of money. Here, all of a sudden, most people say, well, it didn't really intentionally help the environment. That was just a kind of accident. And they don't, the CEO doesn't deserve any credit. And I think this is a general pattern. Like if we want to get credit for anything positive that's happened, we really have to make an effort, and we can't just allow it to happen as a side effect. And so I think that sort of more stringent sort of demands of getting credit for things might be a problem for this idea of filling responsibility gaps of the positive kind by viewing ourselves as acting together with AI systems. It really has to be that we put in an effort and we really, show our own talent in order for us to be positively responsible. Whereas if we're doing something with an AI system and there are bad side effects, then people are going to be more willing to kind of blame us for that, because in general in life, we are supposed to try to avoid creating risks and bad side effects when we are pursuing our own interests. So even though I kind of think that this is the way to go, to think in terms of human machine teams, I think this is much more successful as a strategy when we think about negative, bad responsibility than when we think about positive responsibility. Taking credit for things that AI systems do is going to be harder than accepting. Well, we're not going to want to accept blame, but we are going to be having to accept blame very often, at least because other people are going to blame us. All right, so I've been talking about different kinds of possible gaps when it comes to responsibility. Most people always talk about negative and primarily backward-looking responsibility gaps. But I think we should also think about forward-looking responsibilities and also positive responsibility. So who deserves credit? And there might be many cases in where there are good outcomes, but it's unclear whose responsibility it is to bring them about, or after they've happened, who can take credit. And of course, as I said, we are often quite happy and eager to take credit, but do we really deserve it, so to speak? And I think that if we start outsourcing a lot of tasks to AI systems, then the opportunities we have to take credit for things might be fewer and more a narrower range for us to have those kinds of positive responsibilities. So we should worry about all of these kinds of gaps, and I'm curious to see whether you agree with that or not. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Sven. I'm opening up the floor to questions. I have some of my own, but I want to first give the floor to Ann-Katrin, who has a question.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, I also wrote it in the chat. First of all, thanks for the talk, very interesting. I will add a clarification question, because you talk about command responsibility as an example of organizational responsibility, if I understood you correctly. But then you say it's kind of a group responsibility, whereas I would say that it seems to me, at least, that the commander or the superior or whatever you call him or her is being held individual responsible for the faults made by their subordinates. So I would view it as a form of individual responsibility. So I was wondering whether you could clarify how you see it as a form of group responsibility.
Yeah, no, okay, thanks a lot. I mean, I realize now that I was being unclear. I mean, the way I think about it is that it's a kind of group agency. And so the group is doing something together. So it's not that I'm acting on my own. If I'm, either let's say the soldier carrying out the dirty work, or I'm the commanders commanding people to do things. So it's group level action or behavior. But I agree with you that it's maybe individual responsibility. So let's say you are the commander, and I'm the, you're commanding me to do something, then you might be sort of individually responsible for what we were in effect doing together because we were acting as a team. But yeah, you're right. So, but you might be responsible. And that's what I'm thinking could be a model for how we think about human AI collaboration, that the humans and the AI are doing things together, but depending on the role in the hierarchy, if you will, the humans might take on the kind of responsibility. Yeah, so that's the idea. Absolutely.
Are there further questions?
I did notice that there were things in the chat, but I was not looking at the chat myself.
So Joshua Bronson had a question, but he had to run, so he's no longer in the room. So you can decide for yourself whether you think the question of whether the gap is ontological or epistemic is an interesting one to answer.
Okay, no, yeah, that is an interesting one. I mean, there's certainly for people, I don't know if everyone is familiar with this technical terminology, but epistemic is it has to do with what we know and what we don't know, and so one can ask the question as, okay, maybe there appears to be a gap, but really there isn't one. So that's the ontological part, like what is really the case, so to speak. And I guess I would say that there are probably more apparent responsibility gaps where it seems that there's a gap than there are actual real ones. But on the other hand, I think there are some possible gaps in responsibility where at the very least, it's not, unless we sort of change the way we think about responsibility, our current ways of thinking, this especially applies in the legal case, are not going to carry over. But I mean, to take driving, most legal systems, if not all legal systems, assume that there's a human driver. So either you have to widen the understanding of what it means to drive a car so that you can just sit there and you're still driving, or the company behind the car is driving it or something like that, or you have to change the law so that it's not just the driver who can be responsible. I mean, of course, there are cases where, if I own the car, I lend it out to Olle, and he crashes, then maybe I have some liability in certain legal systems. But anyway, so yeah, certainly from a legal point of view, there are real responsibility gaps when it comes to some forms of technology. I think in the ethical case, there might also be some real gaps, especially when it comes to the positive responsibility gaps, as I said. So, but I would definitely agree that there are more apparent responsibility gaps than there are real ones, more from an epistemic point of view, as the questioner was asking.
But these last examples sound more like they are ontological, but the ontology is socially constructed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, but I mean, I would definitely say that the legal ontology is real, but socially constructed. I think that, I mean, there are people who argue, I mean, like Ronald Dworkin, that the law is somehow supposed to be a channeling of ethics, and ethics is not necessarily socially constructed. I mean, if ethics is socially constructed, which I'm perfectly happy with myself, if that were be the case, it would still be real in a certain sense. I mean, it's a social reality that may be partially socially constructed, but yeah, it's still as you said, social ontology. So it's a kind of ontological question. This might just be that the grounding is social and not sort of I don't know. I was going to say asocial, but that's not what I wanted to say. Non-social. Yeah.
Cecilia, you're waving your hand.
Yes, thank you for this very clear and nicely performed talk. I especially enjoyed your the scheme. It was very helpful. I don't know if it's really it is a question. So I found when you sort of said, instead of asking who's responsible, you sometimes said, how should we distribute? Now I can't even speak English. Well, how should we distribute responsibility? That seems to be a very helpful way of putting it. It leads us in other direction when thinking about this question. And I was then thinking that when you sort of have that in the background, would it be sort of helpful sometimes to figure out how this distributing should go, to ask or to use the asymmetry you pointed to? So normally we raise this question when something has gone wrong, right? So that's sort of often when we sort of want to distribute the responsibility. And would it be helpful to clarify when we have that question to ask, how would we distribute it if this has been a good outcome? If this, because it seems so clear that we would place it with the human, like a lot more. Then we wouldn't be Tesla saying, oh no, that's not our responsibility. We wouldn't be making that move. And that seems to suggest there is something morally bad about making that move. And it becomes sort of clear by asking the question, if this has been a good outcome, who would be praised here?
Yeah, no, I mean, you raised a lot of good points there. So, I mean, just to the very first part of your comment there. So, yeah, I was jumping around a little bit between different ways of putting things, and who is responsible as opposed to like, how should we distribute responsibility among different people? I mean, I was also talking about taking responsibility. I was talking, I think, about holding people responsible. And so these are all related, but they're different. I mean, there are those who say that, well, there are hard facts about who is responsible, so to speak, and we shouldn't talk about holding people responsible or taking responsibility. But as I said, I mean, I tend to agree with this idea that this is a practice, a social practice, and we can think about whether we want to update it and we want to change it and we want to maybe take some bits over here and kind of carry them over to a new area, etc. And if we start thinking in that way, then yeah, you're right that it can be really helpful to ask, okay, so now you're blaming me for something bad that happened, but would you also have praised me if it was a good outcome? That can be a good question. I think sometimes the worry is, as I was saying towards the very end, that we sometimes have actually higher requirements or more stringent requirements for being positively responsible. So whereas we often are willing to view people as responsible for a side effect that's negative of their action, when their actions have sort of good side effects, then quite often we don't think that that's enough. We sort of have to have made a positive effort or had it as part of our goal to produce the good outcome in order to be sort of praiseworthy for it. So there might be an issue that there's more required of you on the side of doing good than of allowing bad things to happen, so to speak. But in general, I do think it's a good idea to kind of take that strategy. And you can also ask, even when I'm being held responsible in a negative sense, might there be in a certain sense something good about it? I mean, I mentioned this example of one of the American presidents who said, yeah, the buck stops with me, as a kind of power move. I mean, I'm also reminded of the trial against Anders Breivik, when he first was declared insane, and he actually didn't like that because he wanted to be held responsible, even if it meant that he would be given a lifetime in prison or whatever. I mean, maybe in Norway you don't get that, but he wanted to be criminally responsible or declared innocent. He didn't want to be declared insane and not able to be either responsible or not. And so sometimes it matters for our sense of agency and self that we are responsible, and that can be a kind of benefit. So I mean, it could be a sense that we're an active agent. We can be a person with power. There can be all sorts of benefits that could make it actually attractive to be responsible. So yeah, there are many questions we can ask, and as you say, we can start thinking about how do we distribute these different responsibilities and benefits and burdens, and that's a very, I think, practical and a pragmatic way of approaching these issues.
So I'm a little bit worried about the forward-looking case, the distinction between negative and positive responsibility.
Yeah.
Suppose there are two possible outcomes, a good one and a bad one, and if it's my responsibility to avoid the bad one or to ensure the good one, does it boil down to which case we define as the default outcome, whether it's a positive or a negative responsibility?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I mean, a lot of the time when people talk about future outcomes, I mean, so for example, Sven Nyholm, he talks about, I think it's what he calls mixed outcomes or something like that. There's a probability of a good outcome and there's a certain probability of a negative outcome when I perform one and the same action. And so you might say that I should be sort of taking responsibility for the package of my, but on the other hand, you might say that you can fill positive responsibility gaps by filling the negative ones. And so people do tend to be willing to take responsibility for avoiding causing harm to other people, whereas they tend to be less willing to take on responsibility to make things good for other people, unless they are, you know, their parent or their doctor or whatever it might be. One worry might be then that we turn creating the good outcome into a kind of a means of the end of avoiding the bad outcome. But as I said, we tend to be unwilling to praise people when they, you know, when they're doing something good, it's just a means to another end. And so we tend to want to, you know, if I'm trying to do good and I achieve it and I put in an effort, then I'm often praiseworthy. But if I do the good just as a means to some other outcome, then that weakens my claim to credit to some extent. But yeah, but certainly the connection between the good and the bad, when we look at the future, that they often are parts of the same course of action, so to speak, which might go either way. Yeah, that is a complication that is worth thinking more about. Absolutely.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments? I had also a comment about, you talked about John Danaher and his suggestion that responsibility gaps might be welcomed. And at first, my first reaction was, this is crazy.
Yeah.
And my second reaction was that in the case of having children and taking responsibility for their exact genetic makeup, maybe that's something that most of us agree that we don't, at least we hesitate very strongly to take that responsibility. Most people are probably happier that there is some random mechanism that somehow does the shuffling of the genes. What do you say about that example?
Yeah, I mean, and that might be the kind of case where moving into the future, I mean, there might be new medical technologies developed where, I mean, there's a similar discussion where about so-called biomarkers. And so, you know, if you examine me now, you might be able to tell whether there's a certain chance or risk that I'm going to get a certain disease, which might be something that my children is going to inherit. And so the question is, do I have a right not to inform myself about, you know, the risks that I'm facing, and do I have a right not to tell my children about it, etc. And so that whole discussion about whether I have to inform myself about all my negative biomarkers and whether I have to kind of pass on that information, I see certain similarity there where you could imagine there might be technologies, biomedical technologies being developed in the future so that you can sort of control some of this randomness. Okay, so I couldn't control the fact that I have this genetic makeup, but maybe I can enhance myself so that I block any possible future bad effects. And you know, do I have a duty to do that or not? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it might be over kind of a burden to take on too many responsibilities. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. The more we know and the more we are able to do we have more and more responsibilities? I mean, that's the sort of thing that John Danaher tends to worry about, that you know, the modern science and modern life is just giving us more and more responsibility all the time, and that's going to be more and more burdensome. And so we should be happy if we can somehow hand over some of that to AI systems that so we don't have to take responsibility.
Cecilia, do you want to add another example?
It was just an example. Yeah, I put it in the chat. It's because positive forward-looking responsibility seems to be something very many politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a good point. And I think also in some traditional justifications of state power, this is kind of a part of it. And so some have argued that you know, you can have a right to have power over me if we give you the task of making sure that things go well for me. If you don't protect my interests, if you don't protect me, so to speak, then why should you have power over me? Then I have a right to try to start a revolution and, you know, oust you and replace you with a benevolent person in power instead. So yeah, that's definitely a traditional one way of thinking about it. And I mean, if our people in power are not, you know, producing good outcomes, then we're going to hold them accountable in different ways, perhaps not vote for them, etc. So yeah, the question would be, you know, can you fill some responsibility gaps related to AI in this way? Well, that might require that they are in charge of AI development, and they might partly be that, but some might argue that, well, they're not well placed to do this. We need a kind of market mechanism and private companies, and they will feel less accountable to people out in society. Some people say that, you know, big companies are becoming almost like some sort of government entities because they have so much power and they influence our lives so much. It's just that they don't want to take on the positive responsibilities that we think that people with power do and should have. So yeah, that might be. Well, maybe if we can merge, I don't know, the big tech companies in the state, which might also be very worrying to some perspectives, then we might solve the issue of who's responsible for making sure that the future is bright, so to speak. But yeah.
I think it's very real that big tech companies and governments are merging in ways that could be disturbing in many ways at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I guess the companies would claim to have this positive, forward-looking responsibility, and that's what they're sort of trying to live up to. But I think many of us get worried when they say so.
Indeed, yeah, and then the picture of what a good future would be like that some tech companies have may be seriously and honestly meant by them, but maybe to some of us it seems more like a nightmare. So yeah. Certainly an interesting perspective.
Sadly, it seems that the 1 hour we have all booked in our calendars for this event has come to an end. I want to thank Sven for his extremely clear and interesting talk, and all the other contributors to the discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you from my side as well. Thank you very much.